I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to look at the aim of philosophy according to Aristotle. It is in the nature of philosophy to inquire into the nature of philosophical inquiry. Let us continue this tradition of reflexivity to then ask, what is the aim of philosophy, by looking at the purported goals of the early philosophers. One of the reasons we continue to study works of philosophers of antiquity is because the questions they asked remain relevant. We are still asking the same questions today. But why did they ask these questions? What were they trying to achieve? What better place to search for the aim of a field of study than its very beginnings? While early approaches in philosophy may seem, in the light of today's advancements, to have oversimplified the problems they attempted to tackle and underdeveloped their arguments given their limited knowledge, this precise naivete is what makes their purported aims clear and pure, uncomplicated by the greater learning and pressures later thinkers have to grapple with. Yet in an attempt to articulate the goals of these early philosophers, we cannot simply go to the earliest one on record, Thales, and interrogate what he did as a basis to express what the aim of philosophy is. Firstly, we do not know what he did and taught, except in what little information had remained. The earliest thoughts and teachings were transmitted orally, and many of the earliest philosophers did not write anything down. Even for those who did, much was lost, such that all we have today are fragments or secondary accounts, or fragments in secondary accounts. However, even if we knew more about each individual thinker, it may not help us understand what their aims were as a collective. The early Western philosophers of antiquity, who have been collectively termed the Pre-Socratic Philosophers, were a loose grouping scattered across the vast reaches of the Greek Empire and across time spanning centuries. To even call them philosophers is anachronistic, since the understanding of what the term philosophy even meant came only later. They did not refer to themselves as philosophers as far as we know, and the appellation was given to them by later thinkers. To examine what this curious group of people were doing and why, despite the separations in space and time, could be considered a collective, we will need a perspective that has sufficient distance to analyze their thought and sufficient insight to draw a line connecting them. For this we turn to Aristotle, the great systemizer of philosophy, who was also the first historian of philosophy. Born several centuries after the earliest philosophers, he begins his work, Metaphysics, by reflecting on the journey of mankind's search for wisdom up to his time, to understand where he stood in the history of ideas, what remained to be done, who and what their ideas were that he was responding to. He surmises, "For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little and stated difficulties about the greater matters, example about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and of the stars and about the genesis of the universe. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant, whence even the lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for the myth is composed of wonders. Therefore, since they philosophized in order to escape from ignorance, evidently they were pursuing science in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end. And this is confirmed by the facts, for it was when almost all the necessities of life and the things that make for comfort and recreation had been secured, that such knowledge began to be sought. Evidently then, we do not seek it for the sake of any other advantage, but as the man is free, we say, who exists for his own sake, and not for another's, so we pursue this as the only free science, for it alone exists for its own sake." I will analyze this quote bit by bit. Aristotle writes, "For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize." It may be hard to imagine now, but there existed a time before philosophy. But was there really a time when people did not wonder about things? What does wonder even mean? I recall the feeling I had as a toddler, looking at a spinning top and wondering what sort of magic it was, this amazing thing weaving in front of me. Imagine a person transported from 1,000 years before and the kind of amazement they might feel when they see tall buildings, a television, escalators, planes, cars, or even an umbrella. That is the wonder Aristotle is talking about. Now imagine primitive people, even more ancient than the ancient Greeks. Such individuals will wonder about many things they encounter: trees, tigers, their own bodies, their offspring, other people, pain, sounds, birds, grass, leaves, water. How do we know that? Because we marvel at the same things today. Aristotle continues. They wondered originally at the obvious difficulties, then advanced little by little and stated difficulties about the greater matters. Example, about the phenomena of the moon and those of the sun and of the stars, and about the genesis of the universe. This primitive person will first be thinking about how to overcome their immediate problems. They need food and water. They suffer from pain, the cold, and the heat. As they come up with solutions for these, such as hunting, finding a river, clothing, and fire, their minds can then be freed from these immediate problems to think about other less pressing things, and finally they would arrive at the big questions, from the nature of the heavens to the grand mysteries of life. Aristotle continues. And a man who is puzzled and wonders thinks himself ignorant, whence even the lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for the myth is composed of wonders. Therefore, since they philosophized in order to escape from ignorance. If a person wonders about something and is puzzled by it, it means that they do not know about it, about how it works, about what is it for, or what to do with it. I press a switch on the wall and the lights come on. If I am not completely used to it yet, I might wonder to myself, how did that happen? If I am interested enough, curious enough, I might try to find out. But first, I must realize I do not know, that I am ignorant, and then be awed enough by it to try to find out. Aristotle uses the word wonder to convey this sense of amazement combined with curiosity. But how do I find out? Remember, he lived in the 4th century before Christ. By Aristotle's era, there were already other thinkers though. In his time in school, he would have been exposed to the poetry of Homer and Hesiod, which he would have studied. These were poems, epic tales of adventures with powerful heroes and strange gods. Prior to the advent of philosophy, the Greek world understood the world through myths. Yet why do myth tellers such as Homer and Hesiod, who were thoroughly studied by young Greek citizens in school, not qualify as philosophers? After all, according to Aristotle, one reason why philosophy arose was in order to escape from ignorance. Myths too play a role in helping people understand their world, albeit through exposed explanations of divine origins with grand narratives. Dissatisfaction with such stories, which have no ability to predict novel occurrences but can explain everything after they happen, began to arise. Xenophanes attacked the mythical tradition on two fronts. The gods were immoral. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods everything that is a shame and reproach among men, stealing and committing adultery and deceiving each other, he observes. They were also anthropomorphic, resembling human beings from their bodies down to their temperaments. The Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, and the Thracians that theirs have light blue eyes and red hair, he writes. But if cattle and horses or lions had hands, all were able to draw with their hands and do the works that men can do. Horses would draw the forms of the gods like horses, and cattle like cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each had themselves. Yet he did not outright reject the notion of gods. He instead sought to purify the concept of the divine, to be in no way similar to mortals either in body or in thought. Religious views were changing. There was a gradual but palpable shift towards a more rational basis in understanding the world. Such a shift to use our reason, logos, instead of simply believing in stories, marks the beginning of philosophy. This use of our intellectual faculty to reason and search for the truth is what distinguishes the philosophers from other thinkers, such as tellers of stories. Aristotle continues. Evidently, they were pursuing science in order to know, and not for any utilitarian end. What was it that they wanted to know? What does it mean that we know something? In the prior chapter, Aristotle talks about two craftsmen, a master worker and a manual worker. While the manual worker may be good in his craft, say to produce a nice table, what puts the master worker above him is that the master worker knows the why and the cause. So say the manual worker can produce mechanically a run-of-the-mill table like those from IKEA. Give him some raw wood and he would know what size to cut it to, how to cut it, how to plane and sand the wood to get rid of its original roughness and its splinters, how and what color to paint the pieces, how to make joints and put the pieces together. He might at first be following a blueprint, a set of instructions, and later he might not even need instructions since he has been repeatedly producing the same table. However, if you ask him to design a table from scratch, say one made out of glass with metal legs, and to develop a blueprint and building instructions for it so that other workers can follow them, he will be unable to do so. For that, you need the master worker who understands the why and the cause, in Aristotle's words. What does the why and the cause mean? The master understands why people want tables. They, for instance, expect to eat dinner on it. It will need to be able to take a certain amount of heat from the pots of food, a certain amount of weight, and how it may be distributed over its surface. Kids may stand on it and it should not break. He understands the strength of the various materials, be they wood, glass or steel, and hence can work out how thick the glass tabletop should be and how many legs will be required. In addition, he will be able to teach others such as the manual worker and also other master workers because he possesses the knowledge of why tables, or for that matter chairs, cupboards and windows too, are designed that way and their causes. I have not yet explained what Aristotle means by cause. Aristotle has a theory of causation. A cause comprises four aspects which confusingly have also been called causes and not aspects, so I would stick to that usage. The four aspects are 1. Material cause, 2. Formal cause, 3. Efficient cause, and 4. Final cause. Using the example of the master worker designing a table, the question will be, what caused the table? The question can be broken down into Aristotle's four aspects of causation. The material cause involves selecting the right material for the purpose. If the table was to be used in the study, wood might be suitable. If it was meant to be in the toilet where it may get wet, perhaps glass is better. The formal cause is about the shape of the table, its design. It needs, for instance, a flat top and not a bowed one, since a table is meant to have things placed on top of it. This form of the table is related to its essence, that is, what makes a table a table. If a table looks like a ball, it will not be called a table because it does not serve its function well. That is, the table will not have the form of a ball. The efficient cause is efficient not in the way we use that word today to indicate how productive a machine or a worker is. It is the efficient cause because it is the factor that causes the effect, in this case the effect of having a table. What made the table? A table maker, in this case the manual worker or the master worker at the table factory, and not, for instance, a taxi driver. Finally, the final cause is about purpose, what the table is ultimately for. Perhaps the table will be used for dining or to study on. It is for the final cause that the three other aspects, the material, formal and efficient causes, are geared towards. Say the final cause of the table is for studying on. Then the material can be wood, the form can be 1 meter by 1.5 meter with a height of 1.2 meter with 4 legs, and it can be made by a carpenter. I've explained Aristotle's theory of causation in some detail because Aristotle defines philosophy as a science that investigates the first principles and causes. So there you have it. The aim of philosophy, according to Aristotle, is to investigate first principles and causes. We philosophize in order to quench our desire to know, to overcome our ignorance. To know is to understand the first principles and causes of things, and by first principles, Aristotle does not mean things like the cause of a table, but of all things. To find universal principles which will cover both material things, such as those of the physical world, and immaterial things, such as the nature of being, society, the good life, art, music, and so on. What is meant by first principles? We can perhaps better understand this by looking at what the early philosophers thought were first principles. These early philosophers want to understand the world without appealing to divine explanations. To be able to do so, W.K.C. Guthrie explains that they have implicitly assumed that there is an underlying order which can be discovered despite the appearance of chaos. They come up with theories and write them into books aptly entitled On Nature, the most famous being Parmenides'. They sought a principle of all things, arche, to explain the origin of all things. For Thales, everything was made of water. For Heraclitus, it was fire, and for others, it was earth or air. For Aristotle though, these first principles they came up with were ultimately dissatisfying because they were only on the material cause. Others like Empedocles talked about love and strife as the first principles to explain how things came about. For the Pythagoreans, it was numbers. For Plato, it was the forms or ideas, which are the idealized version of things found in the heavenly realm, covering both material and immaterial things. For example, there is the form of man, which is the perfect man, but also of the good, which is the ultimate good, or the form of beauty, which is perfect beauty. All these theories, they derived from the use of their reason. We have talked about getting away from myth, from explanations that depended on divine sources. But lest you misunderstand, it is not that gods have been altogether abandoned in philosophical thought. In antiquity, the philosophers still referred to divine beings. Parmenides, in his only extant work on nature, which only fragments remain, spins a short but wonderful tale of how he arrived at his knowledge. He was whisked away by the daughters of the sun on horse carriage to a temple of a goddess. The goddess instructed him to use his reason, which is the way of truth, and not depend on human sense experience, which presents only the appearances of things but not the true reality. Not to depend on custom or authority, all of which is the way of opinion. The gods themselves now are telling us to use our reason to find the truth. This prelude by Parmenides shows us that even as the ancient thinkers move away from myth towards philosophy, it does not mean a rejection of the divine and gods. Lest you think this only applies to the Pre-Socratics, even Plato resorted to myth. In the Republic, there is a story of a soldier named who died and went to the underworld. He later revived and lived to tell the tale of his encounters there, where the wicked were punished and the just were rewarded. In the Timaeus, Plato spins a creation myth where a divine craftsman, the demiurge, imposed order on the cosmos. Fast forward about 1,000 years, medieval philosophy is steeped in religion, the best example being Thomas Aquinas, who was canonized as a saint, whose philosophical work was considered a miracle as he reconciled Aristotle's writings with Christianity. Another medieval example all philosophy students will be familiar with is Ansem's ontological argument for the existence of God. Other medieval thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina incorporated Islamic theology into their philosophy. Modern thinkers like Descartes argued for the existence of God using an argument similar to Ansem. Even in the Enlightenment, which was an era once again attempting to shift from superstition to reason, Immanuel Kant thought that we needed to believe in God if only as a regulative principle. It is only in recent times that theology and philosophy went their separate ways in university departments, and then not quite. Aristotle continues. Evidently they were pursuing science in order to know and not for any utilitarian end. And this is confirmed by the facts. For it was when almost all the necessities of life and the things that make for comfort and recreation had been secured that such knowledge began to be sought. Evidently then, we do not seek it for the sake of any other advantage, but as the man is free, we say, who exists for his own sake and not for another's, so we pursue this as the only free science, for it alone exists for its own sake. Aristotle sees philosophy as a practice done for its own sake and not for any practical purpose. In our current world where money is valued above all else, where the dominating economic paradigm and mindset is driven by questions of utility, how useful an activity or an object is, and how profitable, the pursuit of an activity like philosophy may seem almost foolhardy to some people. Even knowledge acquisition has to justify itself through pointing out potentially lucrative or powerful career paths, and the same has happened for the study of philosophy. I quote the University of Washington Department of Philosophy's website. Students who learn philosophy get a great many benefits from doing so. The tools taught by philosophy are of great use in further education and in employment. Despite the seemingly abstract nature of the questions philosophers ask, the tools philosophy teaches tend to be highly sought after by employers. To be fair, many university philosophy department websites have a similar spiel. Not that philosophers are incapable of making money. Ask Thales, the earliest recorded philosopher who flourished in the 6th century BC and the first monopolist in history. He predicted a good harvest and cornered the olive press market in a bid to prove that it is easy for philosophers to be rich if they choose, but this is not what they care about, according to Aristotle. Ancient Greece practiced slavery, which makes the last line of the quotation particularly poignant. Free persons exist for their own sakes, while for slaves, their existence depends on the whims of their masters. We seek wisdom for its own sake because we want to know, because we have a profound need to understand our world, our existence, and how we can make the world a better place. We are not enslaved to anything or anyone such that we have to seek knowledge for their sake. Or are we? For many of the most fundamental questions that concerns mankind, including our freedom and purpose, we have been asking them since antiquity and are still asking them today. What is the meaning of life? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is justice? What is love? How can we organize ourselves to get the best society? Do we have an immaterial and immortal soul? Earlier, I have singled out the Department of Philosophy of the University of Washington for criticism. To balance the skills and do them justice, I will give them the last word in this essay on the aim of philosophy. Its website also talks about the most important reason to study philosophy, which means that the monetary reasons it earlier gave were lesser ones. I quote, "The most important reason to study philosophy is that it is of enormous and enduring interest. All of us have to answer, for ourselves, the questions asked by philosophers." Thank you. If you wish to support the Philosophical Bachelor, you can do so at worldwideweb.patreon.com/philosophicalbachelor.